To nie koniec wieczoru oczywiście.
It's not the end of the evening. There are still many attractions ahead now. We are going to have a presentation by a lecturer of John Hopkins Institute, Professor Yascha Mounk, and the name of his lecture is Freedom and the Trap of Identity Politics. Professor, the floor is yours.
Dziękuję bardzo. Bardzo się cieszę, specjalnie się
I'm very happy that I'm here in Łódź because this is the city in which my grandmother was born, and I'm here for the first time. It's very special for me to join this festival because I'm a liberal. I work a lot on the ideas of freedom. So here there are a lot of people who are at different ages. And this topic is very important to all these people. So it has something, a lot in common concerning the situation in Poland. Polish is the language of my family. So, however, it's easy to talk about daily things in Polish, but since I'm going to talk about politics, I will switch into English.
Thank you. So, I like to say that I'm a democracy crisis hipster, which is to say that I was worried about the crisis of democracy before it was cool. And I have been talking and writing about the threat that you know very well here in Poland, which populist politicians and candidates pose to democratic institutions for over 10 years at this point. This is a threat which remains very much alive when I look, for example, at the elections in the United States, which are happening in less than 3 weeks. And as has been mentioned a couple of times on this stage today already, the outcome of that election is radically uncertain. There is easily 50% chance that Donald Trump will get re-elected. And that would pose not only a serious threat to democratic institutions within the United States, it would also undermine the Western alliance and democratic values around the world, especially in Ukraine, which is very close to here and which should be at the top of all of our minds. The fight for democracy also continues in other countries, in India, where the political system is more embattled now than it has been perhaps any time in the last 50 years, in countries from Venezuela to Mexico to Hungary and Turkey. And of course, Poland is in a very interesting position because as a political scientist, I feel today that I've traveled to the future. You are dealing with the challenge of what to do when a democratic opposition manages to defeat a populist government, gets into government, gets into power, wants to undo some of the damage to its democratic institutions, but faces the dilemma of how to undo some of those changes in a way that is itself respectful of democratic norms. And this is a challenge that is very hard to get right and which threatens serious consequences if it fails, consequences on the side of democratic norms if the new government actually oversteps the boundaries of what it can legitimately do in a way that just leads to a deepening of a tit-for-tat dynamic of attacks on populist on democratic institutions, but also, of course, electoral penalties. One of the things where we've seen around the world is that populists can come back and be re-elected even once we think that they are defeated. That indeed is what is threatening to happen in the United States. So I remain very engaged with the populist threat to the values of freedom, to liberal values, to the values of liberal democracy. And I look forward to listening to many of the panels about that in the coming days. But in my latest book, I have also been thinking about a different kind of threat to democratic values. A threat that itself also has a double nature, is an electoral threat, but also a substantive threat. And that threat, in my mind, comes from the fact that the political spectrum to which I personally have belonged since I was a teenager, to which I continue to feel deep loyalty, has, in some of its corners, started to sell out the liberal universalist values that have actually allowed us to build these democratic institutions, that has historically allowed us to make great progress towards building a more inclusive society. And I'm talking specifically about an identitarian ideology, which recognizes rightly the deep forms of injustice and discrimination that many minority groups still face in society, but that gives up on the traditional remedy to those injustices. That unlike political activists from Frederick Douglass to the gay and lesbian movement of the past, is not saying we're going to remedy these forms of exclusion and injustice by making people truly equal, by ensuring that our society finally lives up to the long-standing founding values of equal treatment for all citizens, but rather by envisaging a political future in which how we talk to each other and in which how we're treated by the state, in which the opportunities and the rights that we formally have in society is forever going to depend on the kind of groups into which we are born. And so I want to give you two examples of this that go beyond the world of social media, that go beyond the world of some of the sillier things that activists sometimes say or that students have always said, to show you how influential some of these ideas have now become in the country in which I live, in the United States, to motivate why it is worth thinking about this in a serious way. The first is an example that I have seen in many different contexts and that some of my friends who have young children have experienced in their own families. It is children who go to schools in the United States, particularly some of the most elite private schools in big cities like New York and Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles, and who one day at the dinner table learn from their children that the teacher came into class that day and said, if you are white, you're going to go into one classroom. And if you are Latino in the American locution, if you have roots in Latin America, you're going to go into a second classroom. And if you're Asian American, you're going to go into a third classroom. And if you're black, you're going to go into a fourth classroom. And this happens often when kids are as young as 8 or 7 or 6 years old. And the idea behind this is to give these students, particularly the non-white students, a stronger sense of their ethnic identity, a stronger sense of their identity within groups that have historically been discriminated against, in the hopes that that will allow them to fight for justice, to fight for a remedy of these forms of discrimination over more effectively. But as you can imagine, I worry very much about what that will do to a society. I worry about the fact that this is ultimately a way of encouraging the part of our human psychology that we always have to keep in check. The tendency we all have as humans to say, you and you are part of my group, and I might be able to help you, I might be quite courageous in coming to your defense, I might be quite altruistic when it comes to you, but those people over there, they are the outgroup. I don't owe them anything. Perhaps I might be capable of treating them with genuine disregard or cruelty or violence. To manage this psychological instinct is the task of any functioning, civilized, working society, certainly of any diverse democracy, that is supposed to be able to sustain itself over time. And I worry that some of these pedagogical practices that we're now seeing spread in the United States go precisely against that, encourage a form of zero-sum conflict in society that is actually going to prove deeply noxious to our society and to our joint institutions. And I worry particularly about what's going to happen to the group of white kids. Remember, they not only split up the black group and the Asian group and the Latino kids, there's something that the white kids got to do during that time. And the idea here is to teach them a set of ideas that have certain surprising parallels in the Catholic doctrine of original sin, in which they are told that they are responsible for a lot of what's wrong in the country, for a lot of what's wrong in the world. And some people worry that that might make them uncomfortable, and that may be true, and I don't worry too much about that. I think sometimes it's okay to be uncomfortable as part of your education. But what I do worry about is that the intended political effect is going to backfire. That rather than these children learning to atone for the sins of their ancestors, or to feel that they need to struggle to overcome the remnants of white supremacy in their society, what will actually happen is that they will start to identify positively by virtue of their race. That they will say, well, if the black kids are proud of being black, and the Asian kids are proud of being Asian, and the Latino kids are proud of being Latino, then we should be proud of being white. In other words, it is going to strengthen rather than weaken the most dangerous elements in our politics, the kinds of racist attitudes that support some of these populist movements. I will give you one more concrete example which shows that this goes beyond even the norms in many American institutions to the decisions that some of the most important government bodies take. We all want to forget about the pandemic, that I'm going to take you back to it for a moment. I'm going to take you back to a hopeful moment in the pandemic, to the moment in the pandemic when finally life-saving vaccines were becoming available. But we had a limited number of rations of the vaccine at the time. They were being produced as fast as we could, but there weren't enough for everybody to get vaccinated immediately. And so we had to make decisions about whom to vaccinate first. Now, in virtually every country around the world, the health authorities followed a simple principle. They observed that the mortality rate was extremely dependent on age. A 90-year-old had 10 times the likelihood of dying of COVID than an 80-year-old, and an 80-year-old had 10 times the likelihood of dying of COVID than a 70-year-old. So it made sense to vaccinate the oldest first. That is, I believe, what happened in Poland, that's what happened in Germany, that's what happened in Britain, that's what happened in virtually every country around the world. We said, if you're over 90, you get the vaccine today, if you're over 80, you'll get it in 2 weeks, and so on and so forth, until everybody was able to get access to this life-saving medical intervention. I sat through virtually a meeting of the key advisory council to the Centers of Disease Control in the United States that was trying to make a decision about how to distribute the vaccines in the United States. And the model of the CDC suggested that the thing that would save the most lives would be to emulate the same idea, to give it first to the oldest Americans. But they said, because there's been a lot of immigration in Poland, in the United States in the last 50 years, and a lot of that immigration is from people who are not white, and they tend to be younger on average, old Americans are disproportionately white. And so it would be racist, it would be unjust to give vaccines by order of age. And so instead what the CDC suggested, and what many states in America ended up doing, was to mix a little bit of age criteria and make eligible at the same time essential workers. And these essential workers weren't just doctors and nurses in hospitals who certainly did need the vaccine. There were movie producers in Los Angeles. There were bankers in New York City. There were college professors in the state of Maryland like myself. Even though I was teaching on Zoom, I didn't have a right to go teach in person. And so in the end, the people who got the vaccine were some of the most privileged people in society, because everybody was eligible, but there was no doses. So the people who got vaccines were people who were able to drive 2 hours to some rural pharmacy but still happened to have a dose of vaccine. People like a friend of mine who's a great computer programmer who programmed a macro so that he could nab one of the spots on a website of a pharmacy faster than any human moving his mouse to click the right thing. And probably in the end, this policy didn't just kill more Americans, it killed more non-white Americans. Because if you give a vaccine to 2 25-year-old Latino Uber drivers, rather than one 80-year-old Latino retiree, more Latinos are going to die. So when we talk about these policies, we are actually talking about life and death decisions that are very consequential in themselves and that, again, have a potential to inflame our politics in really dangerous ways. Thank God, Republicans in the United States are now crazy enough that they think vaccines are bad. Because unless that was the case, they would have made this a central issue in this campaign and said, you have to vote for us if you want to make sure that your grandma gets access to medical care. So let me explain a little bit about where this ideology comes from, where these really confused ideas, where these decisions taken by some of the most important institutions come about, how it is that we have ended up in this situation. And in my book, called The Identity Trap in English, and we're hoping to translate it into Polish as well, I give a long intellectual history of where these ideas come from, really showing how they originated in some of the ideas that postmodernists argued for in France, how they were appropriated in ways that rather changed them by a set of post-colonial scholars from Edward Said to Gayatri Spivak, and how finally they took the modern form in the form of critical race theorists at American law schools like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw. So if you want to understand really in a lot of detail where these ideas come from, I do some of the work in the book. But I want to boil it down today to some of the core claims that advocates of these ideas make. In order, because this is the freedom games and we're thinking about the values of liberalism, to give you a better set of responses for how liberals can take seriously the injustices of our society, the discrimination in our society, but offer a more hopeful response, a more ambitious response, and a more realistic response, a response that doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater in that way. So I think you can boil down the ideas that I'm talking about, which I refer to by the name of the identity synthesis, so if you like, you can use the more popular term of wokeness, to 3 principal claims. The first of them is to say that the fundamental lens for seeing the world, the fundamental way to understand how society works, is to look at reality through the prism of race, gender, and sexual orientation. But the way to analyze any one social situation, the way to understand the origin of political revolutions or wars, the way to comprehend our public policies is to see them through this kind of lens, just as the Marxists that once governed Poland would always have looked at everything through the lens of social class. One of the most striking examples of this is Robin DiAngelo, a so-called anti-racist writer who was one of the best-selling authors in the United States in the last few years. And she once said that any time that a white person interrupts a black person, they're bringing the whole apparatus of white supremacy to bear on that person. Now, there may be circumstances where that's true. There may be circumstances where, a rich boss is berating a much less privileged employee who happens to be black in a way that invokes an ugly racial history. But there may also be different contexts altogether. Part of friendship is that we sometimes interrupt each other. Part of a spirited and respectful exchange of ideas is that sometimes you get excited and you interrupt each other. Part of it is that sometimes you interrupt each other to finish each other's sentences as a form of affirmation, as a form of showing that you understand each other. I don't think any of you has a single friend whom you've never interrupted. And so it seems to me that this way of seeing the world demonstrates not just that Robin DiAngelo doesn't appear to have a single black friend, but that the vision of a world that she puts forward is one where we couldn't actually have genuine friendship among people from different kinds of groups. It imposes distance on us rather than bringing us closer together. The second key claim of this ideology, or the identity synthesis of wokeness, if you prefer, is to say that all of the problems in our society, all of the injustices, come from the fact that liberal universal values actually are just an attempt to pull the wool over our eyes. Just an attempt to blind us to the reality of our societies. And the true function is to perpetuate the forms of hierarchy and injustices that have always existed here. And the third claim that then comes relatively natural out of the first two claims is that therefore any way to make progress in our society has to involve rejecting these universalist principles and explicitly making how we treat each other, explicitly making how the state treats all of us depend on the kind of identity groups that we are a part of. It is to say, as part of your education, the teacher shouldn't say, you all need to get along, you all need to be friends, you shouldn't think about what group you come from as the first thing. You should think as the first thing as the things you might share, the interests you might share, the games you might play together. It's to say, no, we're going to split you into different groups. It's to say the solution to lack of access to medical care for some group is not to redouble our attempts at equal treatment. It is to say that we're going to make who gets what kind of treatment explicitly depend on, in this case, the race into which they are born. That is the vision that this ideology ultimately aims for. So here, I think, is the liberal, the universalist, the democratic response to these ideas. It is, first of all, to acknowledge that, of course, serious forms of discrimination persist, and that sometimes categories like race, gender, or sexual orientation are the right way to understand a situation, are the right way to look at our society. But this cannot happen at the price of using other kind of lenses, of using other kind of prisms to understand our society. In other contexts, it's going to be social class. In other contexts, it's going to be religion. In other contexts, it's going to be individual behavior, individual aspirations that explain what is happening in our society. Rather than coming with a preformed ideological prism that we're imposing on society, that we think is the magic key to understanding any interaction, we need to look at these interactions, we need to look at social events, we need to look at historical changes, and let these situations teach us which of the different prisms we might apply to it is the most helpful. The second response is to say that the critics of universalist values have gotten precisely wrong how we've been able to make historical progress in the past. They've got exactly wrong how we've been able in the United States to abolish slavery and reach civil rights, how we've been able to make tremendous progress on things like gay rights in Europe in the last decades. It was precisely because of the invocation of the values of freedom that we've been able to do that. Think of one of my favorite speeches, that which Frederick Douglass held on the 4th of July, the American national holiday. Douglass, born into slavery at a time when slavery, holding the speech at a time when slavery still existed in the United States, said, how can you talk hypocritically today about all men being born free and equal when my brethren are still in chains? He talked very clearly about the hypocrisy of his audience at the time. But he didn't say, therefore, give up on that value. Therefore, the Constitution is rotten. No, he said, if you're serious about these values, then you have to join me in my political battle to abolish slavery. He didn't, like so many people that I speak to today, say we should abolish freedom of speech because some people at his time said horrible things in newspapers and other publications. He said, free speech is the dread of tyrants, because it was free speech that allowed Frederick Douglass to argue for his political cause, which was a very unpopular cause before it came to triumph. Free speech, he recognized, was the weapon of the weak and the marginalized, not censorship and restrictions on free speech, because those who censor, those who restrict, are by definition those who are in power, by definition those who get to make decisions. The same is true when I speak to some of my friends in the United States who were among the first who wrote essays defending the idea of gay marriage. Something that seemed unimaginable at the time, something that has now been reached in many countries around the world, and I fully trust will eventually come to be a legal reality here in Poland as well. They tell me that the first fight they had to wage was not against the conservatives and the homophobes and the theocrats who wanted to marginalize gays and lesbians from public life. That fight came next, and it was the most important part. But the first fight they had to fight was to some of the people in their own community who said, marriage, that's for heterosexuals. That's a terrible bourgeois institution. We don't want any part of it. We want to revolutionize society. And they won that fight, saying, no, the problem of the institution of marriage is not its existence, it's that it's excluding us. The way we're going to win the argument for why gays and lesbians should have equal standing in society is by demonstrating that our values are not so different from those of everybody else, that all we're asking for is the inclusion as equals in that set of social practices. And that's how we've been able to bring about some of that change with tremendous speed and tremendous success. And so therefore, the third answer that liberals give to the core principles of the identity synthesis is to say that we're fundamentally wrong about the kind of society that they want to create. That it is a betrayal of our highest aspirations to envisage a society in which the group into which we're born starts to determine more and more the way we can live, the way we interact, the things that define us. But what we should actually aim for is a society in which those things become less important, not because people aren't free to be true to all of the different elements of their identity, not because we want society to be completely homogeneous, but because those things matter less in determining the social standing. Those things matter less in the opportunities that each of us has. And so we are able to be proud of who we are, but we're also able to get into true communication with each other as equal citizens of a free society. That, I think, is the political vision that we should aim for. Now, one of the responses that I sometimes get to this set of arguments is to wonder why it is that I'm talking about this set of issues at a time when there is still a very important battle for democratic values against populists, partially on the left, but particularly on the right. Whether it isn't more important to talk about the threat posed by Donald Trump than some of these bad ideas that are being implemented in schools at the moment. And to that, I have a few responses. The first is that some of this stuff matters in itself. I think it hugely matters what kind of self-conception we are teaching our children to have. When some of the most influential pedagogical institutions in the United States are telling children that the goal of a progressive education is to give kids the right kind of racial self-identification, I think something has gone badly wrong. But the second thing I will say is that it is a profound strategic and tactical mistake to think of the fight against the far right and the fight against some of these bad ideas on the left as standing in tension with each other, as being mutually exclusive. So for the last 5 minutes or so of my talk, I want to go back to where I started with the US election, and to go back where I started with the fact that I've been warning about populism for 10 years at this point. At some point I thought I've been trying to explain why these movements rise, and I've been pointing the finger at all kinds of things, at economic stagnation of living standards, which is true in many countries, but not Poland, for example, at some of the rapid cultural changes that make some people feel like they're losing social status, and that has something to do with it, at the rise of the internet and of social media, which certainly facilitates some of this demagoguery. But isn't it time to look in the mirror a little bit? Isn't it time to wonder why, even though we've been aware of this danger, we've been warning about this danger, there's still so much support for it? And in the case of the US election that is coming up in less than 3 weeks, isn't it time to wonder why it is that even though Donald Trump is aging and he's unpopular and he's broken all his promises and he's already lost an election once, he still has a 50% chance of winning? And when you look at the opinion polls, and when you listen to focus groups, and when you talk to voters, you start to realize the problem is not that the average American loves Donald Trump. They don't. The problem is that they also deeply dislike and distrust the elites in their society, and particularly the Democratic Party and where it stands on many issues. 62% of Americans believe that the Republican Party is too extreme, but 55% of Americans believe that the Democratic Party is too extreme. And that is in part because they associate Democrats with the broader universe of institutions that I've described, because they rightly perceive that there's a great overlap between the kinds of people who make decisions at your local school and the kinds of people that make decisions at the CDC and the kinds of people who staff the rank and file of a Democratic Party, so that now only about 11% of Americans strongly agree with the statement that the Democratic Party shares their values, because they perceive these values as having gone far away from the mainstream of American society. It is also because the Democratic Party on some key issues stands well outside the realm of the kind of values that people currently hold. And so, when I think about how we can renew our commitment to freedom, to liberalism, how we can make the fight for this set of political ideas, I think that we need to become more self-confident in standing up for the basic vision of society it entails. It is one that is self-critical but not self-flagellating. One that is capable of seeing the mistakes in our society without falling into the trap of starting to believe that our societies are somehow evil. And that entails emphasizing some of the tremendous achievements that liberal societies around the world have been able to bring about. Poland is an imperfect country, as the United States is, with genuine challenges and problems like any other democracy in the world. But the distance this country has traveled over the course of the last 30 years, in economic terms, in social terms, and in cultural terms, is incredible. When you look around the world and you ask people what country they want to migrate to, all of the top countries that people say turn out to be liberal democracies. When you look at the countries that place highest in the UN's Human Development Index, all of the top countries turn out to be liberal democracies. And so I think it's time for us to recognize that liberalism has always been a progressive creed. It has always involved wanting to bring social reality into closer alignment with our ideals. And that has always involved criticizing the things on which we fall short. But precisely because of that, it has actually allowed us to make tremendous progress. And that progress is only possible when we're also willing to recognize where things are going well, where we've gotten things right, and the fact that our values can actually point us in the right direction. Thank you very much.
To był profesor Yascha.
It was Professor Yascha Mounk. I hope you can hear us. Thank you very much for your lecture. And last but not least, presentation. Very interesting one. A woman, a life, freedom. Lessons that Iran learned based on Polish solidarity. It will be delivered by the British activist and actress born in Iran, Nazanin Boniadi. The floor is yours.